The millionaire accidentally walked in and saw the single dad getting dressed. She froze and couldn't stop staring at the marks on his body that revealed something extraordinary. Comment your city below and hit subscribe to join our global community. This story has an ending that will blow your mind. The charity gala's soft and carefully orchestrated lighting reflected off the polished marble floors of the grand ballroom, creating patterns of gold and shadow that danced across the cream-colored walls like memories of better times. Madison Ashford stood near a towering arrangement of white orchids and ivory roses, her elegant champagne-colored Valentino dress hugging her slender frame perfectly, the silk fabric whispering against her skin with each subtle movement. Yet despite the dress that cost more than most people earned in a month, despite the diamond teardrops hanging from her ears that had once belonged to a Russian duchess, despite her substantial billion-dollar fortune and the prestigious Ashford name that opened every door in Manhattan, she felt profoundly and utterly out of place in this glittering crowd of New York's elite. At 31 years old, Madison had mastered every high-stakes boardroom negotiation, every investor meeting, every complex corporate negotiation imaginable. She could read a balance sheet in seconds, spot a bad investment from a mile away, and negotiate deals that left Harvard Business School graduates shaking their heads in admiration. But these elaborate social events, with their practiced air kisses and hollow compliments, their conversations that said everything and nothing simultaneously, still made her feel like an outsider looking in through glass at a world she could buy but never truly belong to or understand. She watched couples glide across the dance floor with practiced grace, saw women laugh at jokes that weren't funny, observed men network with the intensity of hunters stalking prey. Everyone here wanted something from someone else. Everyone was performing a carefully choreographed role in the endless theater of wealth and privilege. Her father, Richard Ashford, had built an impressive empire through decades of hard work, dedication, and strategic thinking that bordered on ruthless. He had started with a single apartment building in Queens and transformed it into Ashford Industries, one of the most powerful real estate development companies in the nation. Madison had inherited not just the substantial wealth, but also the crushing weight of expectations that came with the Ashford name and its legacy. People looked at her and saw dollar signs, saw opportunity, saw a beautiful blonde trophy who could elevate their social status or fund their dreams. They rarely saw her, the woman who lay awake at 3 a.m. questioning every decision, the daughter who still desperately sought her distant father's approval, the lonely soul who wondered if anyone would ever love her for herself rather than for what she could provide. Tonight, she excused herself from yet another tedious conversation with a venture capitalist, twice her age, who kept finding excuses to touch her elbow while discussing cryptocurrency investments. The man's breath smelled of expensive scotch and desperation, and his eyes kept drifting to her neckline rather than her face when she spoke about emerging markets. Madison felt her skin crawl beneath the silk dress, felt the familiar exhaustion that came from being treated as an object rather than a person settle into her bones like winter cold. She needed air, she needed space. She needed refuge from this suffocating atmosphere where everyone wanted a piece of her, but nobody wanted to know her. Seeking peaceful refuge, she slipped away toward the private corridors that led to the guest facilities, away from the noise and the grasping hands and the hollow conversations about nothing that mattered. Madison had always been fiercely and intensely independent, had built her identity around not needing anyone to complete her or validate her worth and existence. It was safer that way, she'd learned. If you didn't need anyone, they couldn't disappoint you. If you didn't let anyone close, they couldn't see the cracks in your carefully constructed facade. Her Fifth Avenue penthouse apartment was filled with everything money could buy. Priceless art from famous artists like Rothko and Basquiat that most people only saw in museums. Rare wines from prestigious vineyards in Burgundy and Tuscany. Panoramic floor-to-ceiling views of Central Park and the Manhattan skyline that took your breath away at night when the city lit up like a constellation of earthbound stars. She had a walk-in closet the size of most people's bedrooms, a marble bathroom with heated floors, and a soaking tub that could fit 3 people. A kitchen with appliances she barely used because eating alone in that vast space felt more depressing than ordering takeout. Yet something essential and fundamental remained missing from her life and her heart. An emptiness that no amount of acquisition could fill, a loneliness that echoed through those high-ceilinged rooms, no matter how she tried to ignore it. Her well-meaning friends constantly tried to set her up with eligible men from their social circles. CEOs and hedge fund managers, surgeons and attorneys, even a minor European royal who spent more time on his hair than she did. They paraded bachelors through her life like merchandise at an auction block, each one theoretically perfect on paper, but hollow in person. But Madison craved something real, something genuine that couldn't be purchased or negotiated away, something that would make her feel alive instead of merely existing in her gilded cage. She wanted someone who would see her beyond the zeros in her bank account, who would love her for her complexity and depth and flaws, rather than for her wealth and connections and famous last name. She wanted someone who would challenge her, argue with her, make her think and feel and grow, instead of just agreeing with everything she said, because they wanted something from her. She wanted authenticity in a world built on carefully maintained illusions. The hallway was mercifully empty and quiet as she walked carefully, her expensive Louboutin heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor with each careful step, the sound echoing gently off the walls hung with expensive abstract art. The corridor smelled faintly of jasmine from the flower arrangements placed on antique side tables, mixed with the subtle scent of old money and privilege that seemed to permeate every corner of this exclusive venue. She passed closed doors with brass plaques indicating private meeting rooms and guest facilities, her mind already composing an excuse to leave the gala early and escape back to the solitude of her penthouse, where she could finally take off this uncomfortable dress and these pinching heels and just breathe without performing for anyone. She turned toward what she thought was the powder room, based on a conversation she'd half heard earlier, her hand reaching for the ornate brass handle. But when she pushed open the heavy wooden door with its carved mahogany panels, expecting to find mirrors and marble sinks, she froze completely and utterly, standing before her in the center of what was clearly a private changing room, silhouetted dramatically against tall windows where pale moonlight streamed through sheer curtains, was a man in various states of undress. His back was partially turned to her. His rental tuxedo jacket hung carefully on a wooden valet stand, his white dress shirt unbuttoned and hanging open to reveal his bare torso, and she found herself unable to look away no matter how loudly her brain screamed at her to close the door and apologize and flee. For a moment that stretched into eternity, time seemed to suspend itself completely around them both, as if the universe itself had paused to witness this unexpected collision of 2 souls who had no business being in the same room, let alone staring at each other in mutual shock. Madison should have immediately apologized and backed out politely with profuse apologies and burning cheeks, should have turned and fled and pretended this never happened. But something deep and primal rooted her to the spot, paralyzing her with shock and overwhelming surprise, and something else she couldn't quite name. A magnetic pull, a recognition, a sense that she was seeing something important, something real in a world of carefully constructed fakery. It wasn't just that he was undeniably handsome in a rough, unpolished way that was so different from the carefully groomed men in the ballroom, with powerful shoulders that spoke of physical labor rather than gym memberships, with a strong neck and a chiseled jawline that spoke of strength and resilience and hardship endured. It wasn't just the way the moonlight painted silver highlights across his bare skin, or the way his dark hair fell slightly across his forehead in a way that made him look younger and more vulnerable than he probably was. It was what his bare torso revealed that captivated her completely and utterly, that made her breath catch in her throat and her heart hammer against her ribs, a complex, intricate map of scars that told a story far more compelling and honest than any gilded biography she'd ever read at those tedious society events. There was a long, jagged line across his left shoulder, thick and raised, the kind of scar that spoke of serious injury and probably surgery and definitely pain. Another scar curved dramatically along his ribs on the right side, disappearing beneath the waistband of his dress pants, this one looking like it might have been from a blade or something equally violent. Smaller marks were scattered across his chest, like punctuation marks in a narrative of survival and resilience, what looked like burn scars on his upper right chest, a few round marks that could have been bullet wounds or something similar, thin white lines that had faded with time but still told their stories to anyone who cared to read them. His body was a testament to a life lived outside the safe boundaries of wealth and privilege, a life where danger was real and consequences were written permanently on skin. "Oh my God, I'm so incredibly sorry," Madison finally managed to say, though she made absolutely no move to leave the room. Her eyes remained fixed on the network of scars crisscrossing his body, unable to look away despite her embarrassment and shock. In that moment, every carefully constructed wall she'd spent years building around her guarded heart seemed to develop hairline fractures. The man turned to face her fully, and she saw surprise flicker across his handsome face before it shifted to something more guarded and defensive. His dark eyes assessed her with the wariness of someone accustomed to being judged harshly, found wanting, or treated as a curiosity. He quickly pulled on his white dress shirt, methodically covering the tapestry of his past, but it was already too late. Madison had already seen everything, and in that moment of seeing, something fundamental had shifted within her soul. Marcus Sterling had long ago accepted that his visible scars made people deeply uncomfortable and uneasy, that they triggered reactions ranging from poorly concealed disgust to intrusive questions to the worst response of all, pity. At 34 years old, he'd learned through painful experience to wear long sleeves even during the hottest summer months when sweat dripped down his back and he felt like he was suffocating in the fabric. He'd learned to shower quickly in the mornings before his 8-year-old son Daniel woke up, to change clothes behind locked doors, to avoid any situation that might require him to remove his shirt in public. He'd become an expert at deflection, at changing the subject when people asked about that time he'd been hurt, at constructing elaborate excuses to avoid beach trips and pool parties and anywhere else that his body might become a topic of conversation. The burns from the warehouse fire that killed 2 of his co-workers, men he'd known since high school, men who had families and dreams and futures that ended in smoke and flames, still sometimes woke him in the middle of the night with phantom pain and the smell of burning wood in his nostrils, even though the fire had happened over a decade ago. The stab wound from the convenience store robbery he'd tried courageously to stop, thinking he was invincible at 28 years old, thinking he could take down an armed criminal with his bare hands like some kind of action movie hero, had nearly killed him and left him with nerve damage that still occasionally made his right side go numb when the weather changed. The fragments of shrapnel from his time serving overseas before his father's sudden and unexpected death, the scars from that tour of duty that he never talked about even with his therapist, carried memories he'd spent years trying to bury beneath routine and responsibility and the desperate focus on being a good father. These scars weren't badges of honor in polite society, weren't symbols of bravery or sacrifice that people respected or admired. They were marks of otherness, visible proof that he came from a different world than the people in that ballroom, that he'd lived a life where consequences were real and permanent and written on skin. They were reminders of a reckless and foolish youth spent playing hero without considering the cost, without thinking about who would raise his son if he died chasing some misguided sense of nobility. They were evidence of all the ways he'd failed to protect himself so he could be there for the people who needed him most. Tonight, he was serving as a reluctant and somewhat unwilling chaperone for a fundraiser benefiting at-risk youth in his neighborhood, an organization that provided mentorship and educational support to kids who were following the same dangerous path he'd once walked. It was deeply ironic, really. He'd been one of those struggling kids once, angry and lost and broken, getting into fights and making terrible decisions that could have landed him in prison or worse. His live-in nanny, Mrs. Chen, a 60-year-old woman who had been helping him with Daniel since his wife's death, volunteered with the organization and had needed someone to attend the event with her. Marcus had reluctantly agreed to help, despite his discomfort with these kinds of gatherings, knowing full well that his presence at a high society gathering full of Manhattan's elite would be about as welcome as a thunderstorm at an outdoor garden party, that he'd spend the entire evening feeling like an imposter in borrowed formal wear. He'd been changing into his rental tuxedo in this small private room that Mrs. Chen had managed to secure for him, grateful to finally have a moment away from the suffocating atmosphere of wealth and privilege that permeated the ballroom like an expensive perfume he was allergic to. He'd been thinking about Daniel, about whether his son was okay with the teenage babysitter, about whether he'd remembered to pay the electric bill that was due tomorrow, about anything other than the fact that he was surrounded by people who had more money in their checking accounts than he'd earn in a lifetime. And then the door had suddenly opened unexpectedly, and a woman, who clearly belonged in that world of wealth and privilege, stood frozen in the doorway, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. The woman in the doorway was a stunning vision, all elegant lines and golden hair that seemed to catch and reflect the moonlight perfectly with each subtle movement, like something out of a classic Hollywood film. She wore a dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent, and diamonds sparkled at her ears and throat with the casual opulence of someone who'd never had to check a price tag in her life. She was exactly the kind of woman who would normally look through him like he was invisible, or worse, look at him with that mixture of curiosity and distaste that people from her world reserved for people from his. But what struck Marcus most profoundly, what made him freeze with his shirt unbuttoned and his scars on full display, was the way she looked at him. Not with the usual recoil or forced politeness he'd grown accustomed to over years of disappointing encounters, but with an intensity that felt almost hungry and genuinely curious, like she was seeing something fascinating rather than something shameful, like she was trying desperately to read something written on his skin, to understand the story his scars told, to see beyond the wounds to the man beneath them. Her eyes moved over his chest with an expression that wasn't disgust or pity. It was something closer to wonder, to recognition, to a kind of seeing that made him feel simultaneously exposed and strangely validated. "I'm Marcus," he said, instinctively reaching for his shirt to cover himself, his fingers fumbling with the buttons in his haste, carefully avoiding meeting her eyes directly because he couldn't bear to see the inevitable shift from curiosity to disgust. "I think you have the wrong room, miss. The ladies' facilities are 2 doors down on the left." But she didn't leave. She didn't apologize again and back away with embarrassment written all over her face. She remained frozen in the doorway as if her feet had grown roots, her hand still gripping the brass door handle, her expression a mixture of shock and something he couldn't quite name or understand, something that looked almost like longing, like she'd found something she'd been searching for without knowing she was looking. The way she looked at his scars, it wasn't with disgust or pity or judgment or any of the reactions he'd learned to expect and steel himself against. It was almost as if she could see through them to the real person underneath, seeing past his armor to his humanity, reading the story written on his skin and finding it worthy of attention rather than dismissal. Madison Ashford, she said finally, her voice surprisingly steady and composed, despite the color rising in her cheeks, despite the way her chest rose and fell with quickened breath. I apologize sincerely for the intrusion. I was looking for the powder room. This is definitely and awkwardly not what I expected to find here tonight. A pause, then, "Are you okay? I mean, those scars, they look like they must have hurt terribly." The question caught him off guard. Most people pretended not to notice, or if they did ask, it was with morbid curiosity rather than genuine concern. But there was something in her voice, something soft and real, that made him want to answer honestly, instead of deflecting, as he usually did. "They did," he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "But they healed. Everything heals eventually, even if it leaves marks behind." She nodded slowly, as if he'd said something profound instead of stating the obvious. "I think the marks are what make us interesting," she said quietly. "Everything else is just surface." Despite everything, despite being caught half-dressed, despite the awkwardness of the situation, despite every instinct telling him that a woman like her had no business being interested in a man like him, Marcus felt a genuine smile tug at his lips, the first real smile he'd felt all evening. Awkward doesn't quite cover it, does it? She laughed then, a genuine, surprised laugh that lit up her entire face and made her look younger and less guarded. A laugh that seemed to surprise them both equally with its spontaneity and warmth. "No, it really doesn't. Though I have to say, this is the most interesting thing that's happened to me at one of these events in years. Maybe ever." They stood there for another moment, neither quite sure what to say, the air between them charged with something neither of them wanted to acknowledge but couldn't ignore. Madison's eyes kept being drawn back to his chest, where the shirt now covered the scars, as if she could still see them through the fabric, as if they'd been imprinted on her memory in those few seconds of revelation. "I should let you finish changing," she said finally, reluctantly, taking one small step backward into the hallway. "I'm sorry again for barging in." "Don't be," Marcus said, and he meant it. It was nice to meet you, Madison Ashford." "Nice to meet you too, Marcus." She paused, waiting. "Sterling. Marcus Sterling." "Marcus Sterling," she repeated, as if committing the name to memory, as if it mattered that she remember it. And then, with visible effort, she turned to leave. As she finally turned to leave, and the door closed softly behind her, Marcus watched her go through the narrowing gap, feeling something unfamiliar and electric stir deep within his chest, something he hadn't felt since before his wife died, maybe something he'd never felt quite like this before. It was more than attraction, though she was undeniably beautiful. It was the way she'd looked at him, really looked at him, scars and all, and hadn't turned away. It was the warmth in her voice when she'd asked if he was okay. It was the sense that she'd seen him, truly seen him, in a way that no one had in years. In all his carefully constructed solitude, in all the years he'd spent protecting his heart fiercely for his son's sake, building walls around himself to ensure that Daniel never had to experience another loss, he'd never experienced anything quite like the electric current that had passed between them in those few breathless seconds. He stood there alone in the empty room, his reflection in the window showing a man whose expression was equal parts confused and hopeful, and wondered if he'd just imagined the whole impossible encounter, or if it had really happened exactly as he remembered. A woman who looked at his scars and saw beauty instead of damage, who looked at him and saw someone worth remembering. Madison returned to the gala, but her entire evening had been fundamentally altered by that single transformative encounter. She moved through conversations like a practiced actress on stage, offering the right responses at precisely the right moments, all while her mind remained fixed on those scars and the mysterious story they suggested. Who was he? How had he gotten them, and why did the vulnerability she'd glimpsed in his eyes feel more real and genuine than anything she'd experienced in her entire privileged life? She found herself unconsciously scanning the crowd, searching and hoping to see him again before the evening ended. The evening was drawing to a close when she spotted him across the ballroom, wearing his rental tuxedo with the careful posture of someone unaccustomed to formal wear and high society. He stood slightly apart from the throng, nursing a glass of water, watching the dancers with the detached gaze of someone observing a foreign culture they didn't quite understand or belong to. Their eyes met for a brief fraction of a second before he deliberately looked away, his jaw tightening slightly with tension. Madison's heart raced with adrenaline and excitement. She excused herself from yet another conversation and made her way toward him, unsure what she would say, but unable to stop herself from trying. At 31, she had built a reputation as a ruthless negotiator and shrewd businesswoman, a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and precisely how to get it. But as she approached him, she felt entirely uncertain and vulnerable. "Hi," she said simply, positioning herself beside him at the edge of the dance floor. Avoiding the festivities, Marcus turned to her, surprise and something like wariness crossing his features. "Miss Ashford, I didn't expect to see you over here tonight." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully and deliberately. "Aren't you supposed to be the guest of honor? I heard someone mention the Ashford Foundation made a significant donation tonight." My father's donation, technically," Madison corrected, looking straight ahead at the dancers, moving gracefully across the floor. "I just attended for show and family obligation, and you're avoiding answering my question directly." Despite himself, Marcus smiled slightly. "I'm not really a dancer. Haven't been to one of these charity events in a very long time." "Why now?" she asked with genuine curiosity. "My nanny needed someone to accompany her tonight. She works with the foundation, helps identify scholarship recipients for their programs." He paused, considering carefully. I couldn't say no to her. Madison turned to face him fully, and in the soft light of the ballroom, she could see the careful construction of his entire exterior. The buttoned-up shirt with its long sleeves that covered his arms completely, the tie knotted with precision and care, the hair combed back neatly, all of it an armor against the world and its judgments. "You volunteer your time." "My son is at an age where he notices what his father does," Marcus said quietly. "I want him to understand that having money, or not having it, doesn't excuse anyone from being useful to the world and to people in need." Something in Madison's chest tightened uncomfortably. "You have a son?" 8 years old. "The absolute light of my life," Marcus said, and there was unmistakable tenderness and deep love in his voice when he mentioned his child. "His name is Daniel." "That's wonderful," Madison said sincerely, and she meant every word deeply. But beneath the sincerity, she felt a flutter of apprehension. A child meant complexity and significant complications. It meant a woman couldn't simply insert herself into someone's life and expect it to work out perfectly, like in the novels she sometimes read when she couldn't sleep at night. "Is it?" Marcus asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his tone. "You don't strike me as someone who finds family situations wonderful and simple. You seem more like someone who finds them complicated and challenging." Madison laughed at his remarkable perceptiveness and ability to read her carefully. "Is it that obvious?" "I've learned to read people carefully," he said. "It's a useful skill when you're trying to figure out who's interested in your bank account versus who's actually interested in you as a person." "And which am I?" she asked before she could stop herself, the words tumbling out impulsively. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face intently. "I haven't decided yet completely, but I'm definitely intrigued." They talked until the gala ended completely, standing at the edge of the dance floor while the city's elite celebrated around them in their bubble. Marcus told her about Daniel, about the small architectural firm he'd built from nothing, about the deep pleasure he took in designing buildings that served a purpose beyond mere aesthetics. Madison found herself sharing things she rarely admitted to anyone: the loneliness that accompanied great wealth, the constant pressure to be impressive, the fear that no one would ever want her for herself. As the evening drew to a close and the valets began bringing cars around, Marcus walked her outside. The November air was crisp and cool against her skin. "I'd like to see you again," he said. "But I should be honest with you. My life isn't simple. Daniel is my priority. I've learned the hard way that relationships require honesty and commitment." "I don't do casual," Madison replied firmly, "and I respect a man who puts his child first above all else." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face completely. "Dinner? Next Saturday?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes." Marcus chose a small Italian restaurant in Brooklyn for their first date, a family-owned place called Antonio's that had been serving the neighborhood for 3 generations, far from the glittering Michelin-starred establishments in Manhattan, where Madison typically dined and mingled with clients and investors. The restaurant had red-checked tablecloths and candles stuck in old wine bottles, photographs of Sicily covering the walls, and the heavenly smell of garlic and fresh basil filling the air. It was authentic and unpretentious, the kind of place where the owner knew his regulars by name, and the portions were generous enough to take home leftovers. They sat in a quiet corner booth with cracked leather seats, and over heaping plates of homemade pasta and glasses of house Chianti, they began the careful work of letting someone else into the fortified spaces of their hearts. The candlelight made everything feel intimate and real and raw, casting dancing shadows across their faces, making the outside world fade away until there was only this small circle of warmth and honesty. Madison found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did on dates, not worrying about saying the right thing or projecting the right image, just being herself. "So, tell me about the scars," Madison said gently, after their second glass of wine had loosened some of the careful guardedness between them. "I mean, only if you want to. You don't have to." Marcus set down his fork slowly and deliberately. This was the moment he'd both been dreading and anticipating since they'd met. Every woman he'd dated since his wife's death had eventually asked, often with morbid curiosity or thinly veiled concern. He'd learned to give them a sanitized version, a vague story about youthful mistakes and bad timing that revealed nothing real. But something about Madison made him want to tell her the truth, the whole truth, no matter the risk or consequences. "The shoulder scar is from when I was 22, he began, his voice steady and controlled. "I was working at a warehouse and there was a fire. Some equipment went up in flames, and I tried to help get people out. I wasn't thinking, just reacting instinctively. A burning beam fell, and I got caught beneath it." Madison reached across the table and placed her hand on his arm gently. He looked at her, seeing no pity in her eyes, only understanding and genuine care. "The ribs came from about 5 years ago," he continued. "I was walking home late and interrupted a robbery at a convenience store. The guy had a knife. I thought I was invincible, like the rules didn't apply to me." He laughed bitterly. "Nearly died, proving how stupid that was." "But you survived," Madison said quietly. "I did, and it woke me up completely. I realized I had a son who needed his father alive and present, not playing hero and bleeding out on some street corner." He paused, his eyes distant, "and then my father died suddenly." He told her about his father's unexpected heart attack, about having to come home to run the family business, about the guilt of feeling relief that he finally had a legitimate reason to grow up and be responsible, about meeting his wife at that time and how she'd grounded him, helped him build something real and lasting. "You were married," Madison asked, and he heard the careful neutrality in her voice. For 7 years. She died when Daniel was 4. Leukemia. The words were stark, unembellished, spoken as simple fact. It was a long time ago now, but some days it feels like yesterday. Madison was quiet for a long moment, letting the weight of his loss settle between them. That's why you're so protective of him. I can't control everything that happens to him, but I can control whether I'm present for it, whether he knows he's loved, completely and unconditionally. Marcus looked directly at her eyes. I had to learn to live again after losing my wife. That experience changed everything about how I see life and love. Madison understood then, in a way she hadn't fully before, the weight he carried every single day. She'd spent her life trying to fill the void left by her mother's death, not through presence, but through achievement and accumulation of things. Looking at Marcus, she saw a man who'd chosen a different path, presence over possession, authenticity over achievement. "Can I meet him?" she asked impulsively. "Daniel?" Marcus looked at her, genuine surprise flickering across his features. "That's fast. That's a significant step." "I know," Madison said. "But if we're doing this, and I think we are, then I need to know if I'm the kind of person who can be in his life, and you need to know if I can handle it." "Can you?" Marcus asked carefully. "Handle a child in your life? It's not glamorous. It's complicated." "Everything worthwhile is," Madison said simply and truthfully. Madison first met Daniel on a Saturday morning in early December at Marcus's apartment. Marcus had prepared meticulously, toys organized into labeled bins, books arranged by reading level, his son's artwork displayed on the refrigerator with careful pride and love. When Madison arrived with coffee and fresh pastries, she found them in the kitchen, Daniel drawing pictures while Marcus made French toast. The boy looked up when she entered, and Madison saw intelligence and directness in his 8-year-old eyes. "Hi," Daniel said politely, the way he'd clearly been instructed by his father. "I'm Daniel." "The Madison," she said, extending her hand. When he shook it seriously with surprising gravity, something cracked open inside her chest. This child was important to her already, she realized with surprise and wonder. They spent the morning at the Museum of Natural History, with Daniel providing running commentary on dinosaurs and prehistoric life. Madison found herself genuinely enjoying his company, funny without trying to be, curious about the world in a way that reminded her why she'd initially become interested in architecture and design, the desire to create something meaningful that would matter. Lunch was at a small pizza place in Washington Heights, where Daniel became more comfortable and started asking Madison personal questions. Where was she from? What was her favorite color? Did she have any pets? These simple questions revealed his open, genuine interest in knowing her as a person. "No pets," Madison admitted. "My schedule has never allowed for it." "Why?" Daniel asked with the direct logic of childhood that cuts through pretense. "Because I work a lot," Madison explained. "Building things, making deals, trying to do something that matters in the world." "My dad does that too," Daniel said seriously, "but he says family matters more. That's why he picks me up from school even when he has important meetings." Madison glanced at Marcus, who was watching her carefully, gauging her reaction. She understood what this moment meant. Daniel had just given her a glimpse of the hierarchy of values Marcus operated by. Work was important, yes, but people were paramount and came first. After dropping Daniel at a friend's birthday party, Marcus and Madison found themselves alone in his apartment. It was a modest space for New York, a 3-bedroom in a renovated brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. The furniture was comfortable rather than expensive, and the walls were covered with photographs. Daniel at various ages, Marcus's late wife smiling warmly at the camera, pictures of Marcus with his father. "He's wonderful," Madison said, moving to look more closely at the photographs. "He has your eyes." "He has her laugh," Marcus said softly, looking at a picture of his late wife. "My wife. She was extraordinary, the kind of person who made you want to be better just by knowing her." Madison turned to look at him. "I'm sorry you lost her." "So am I, but I got Daniel out of it, and he's the best thing that ever happened to me." Marcus studied Madison's face carefully. "Are you scared?" "Terrified," Madison admitted. "Of what? Of how much this could hurt? Of being responsible for someone else's happiness? Of being expected to be something I'm not?" Marcus closed the distance between them. "You don't have to be anything other than yourself. That's all I'm asking." When he kissed her, it felt less like a beginning and more like a recognition of something that had been waiting to happen. 6 weeks into their relationship, Madison was spending most of her time between her penthouse and Marcus's brownstone. She'd fallen into an easy rhythm with both of them, helping Daniel with homework, attending his school concerts, cooking dinner on weekends. It was a life she'd never imagined wanting, and it terrified her deeply. On a frozen January evening, while Daniel was at a sleepover with friends, Marcus revealed another crucial layer of his carefully constructed life. They sat on his roof, wrapped in thick blankets, looking out at the glittering Manhattan skyline sparkling below them in the cold. "There's something I never told you," he said quietly. "About my father." Madison waited, sensing the gravity of what was coming. "He was connected to organized crime," Marcus said without preamble. "Nothing violent directly, but money laundering mostly. He was careful about it, mostly legitimate on the surface, but underneath." Marcus shook his head. "When he died, I inherited a complete mess. Not just financially, but morally and ethically." Madison felt her stomach tighten. This was the thing she'd been waiting for. The revelation that would make Marcus more complicated than she'd initially thought. "What did you do?" she asked carefully. "I cleaned it up. It took 3 years and cost me a significant portion of my inheritance, but I liquidated everything that came from questionable sources and turned the business completely legitimate. I thought about turning him in posthumously, but decided that would just hurt Daniel and accomplish nothing positive." He turned to look at her directly. "My point is, I'm not perfect. My family isn't perfect. I've made compromises that don't sit easy with me." Madison thought about the Ashford fortune, built partly on questionable real estate deals and aggressive tax practices that skirted the edge of legality. She thought about her father's ruthlessness and willingness to sacrifice people for profit. "My family has its own skeleton," she said finally. "My father's business practices have never been entirely above board, and I've benefited from that my whole life." "Do you feel guilty?" Marcus asked. "Every single day," Madison admitted. "Which is why I've started putting my own money into education and social programs. It doesn't absolve me, but it's something meaningful." Marcus took her hand. "We're not our families. We're not even our mistakes. We're just people trying to do better than the generation before us. Is that enough? That—" Madison wondered aloud into the cold night air. "It has to be," Marcus said firmly, "because perfection is impossible for all of us." February brought the first real test of their relationship. Madison's father had a health scare, nothing ultimately serious, but serious enough to frighten her deeply. She found herself taking on even more responsibility at Ashford Industries, working late nights and flying to different cities for emergency meetings. Her relationship with Marcus became squeezed into the margins of her schedule. "I can't do this right now," she said one evening after missing Daniel's school play because of a board meeting that ran until 8 p.m. "This is too much. I can't handle all of this." They were in her penthouse, and Marcus was standing at the window, looking at the city she'd conquered, but never quite felt part of. "I know it's hard," he said quietly, "but running away won't make it easier, it will make it worse. I'm not running, I'm being realistic." Madison stood, her arms wrapped around herself. "You have Daniel. You have your business. I have a corporation with thousands of employees depending on me. These things don't mesh together easily." "They don't have to," Marcus said. "Not perfectly. But they have to mesh well enough that we don't lose each other in the process." "What if that's not possible?" Madison asked, and there was genuine fear in her voice. Marcus crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. "Then we figure it out together. But I'm not letting you go without a fight. I care about you too much." Madison buried her face in his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, thinking about how that same heart had been broken by loss and still had the capacity to open again. If he could do it, so could she. She had to believe that. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he said. "So am I. But we'll figure this out together." Spring arrived with unexpected complications that neither of them had anticipated or prepared for. Marcus had been keeping a secret of his own, one he'd been wrestling with for months in his mind. The architectural firm he'd built had recently caught the attention of a major developer, someone willing to invest significantly in Marcus's vision for sustainable urban development and green building. The opportunity was everything he'd worked toward, but it required him to take on a partner, which meant scrutiny into his background and finances. Madison discovered this accidentally, overhearing a phone conversation while picking Daniel up from school early. She waited until Daniel was in bed before confronting Marcus about his secrecy. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, anger and hurt warring in her voice. "About the partnership offer?" Marcus set down the architectural plans he'd been reviewing carefully. "Because I knew you'd try to help, and I need to do this on my own terms." "Why would helping be a bad thing?" Madison demanded. "We're in a relationship. We're supposed to support each other." "We are," Marcus said carefully. "But part of me being with you needs to be that I can provide for my son, that I can build something meaningful without leveraging your wealth or your connections." "That's pride talking," Madison said sharply. "And it's stupid and self-defeating. I have resources. Why shouldn't I use them to help the people I care about most?" "Because then I'm not your partner," Marcus said. "I'm your project, your charity case with good scars and a sad backstory." The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Madison realized with uncomfortable clarity that part of what attracted her to Marcus was the idea of being his savior, of healing someone broken with her love and money. "That's not fair," she said, but her voice was uncertain. "Isn't it?" Marcus stood, frustration evident in every line of his body. "You grew up with everything, Madison. You've never had to struggle for anything, and now you're with a guy who's spent his whole life fighting just to have stability, and you want to make it all better by throwing money at the problem." "I want to make it better by being with you," Madison's voice rose, "by supporting you. Then support me by letting me be a man who can do things without your help. Let me have this one thing that's mine." Madison left his apartment and went home, her mind churning with guilt and realization. In the cab, she called her therapist, something she rarely did outside of their scheduled sessions. "He's right," she admitted after explaining the situation completely. "Part of why I'm attracted to him is because he needs me. I've spent my whole life being needed by a corporation. Now I'm in a relationship with someone who actually needs me as a person." "Does he?" her therapist asked gently. "Or do you need to be needed?" The question haunted Madison through the night and into the next day. 2 weeks passed with minimal contact between them. Daniel, sensing the tension and conflict, became quieter and more withdrawn from everyone around him. It was Mr. Chen, Marcus's father's closest friend, who ran a small restaurant in their neighborhood, who finally forced the issue and pushed them toward resolution. Mr. Chen had known Marcus since childhood. He'd watched him grow up, seen him work construction as a teenager, been present when Marcus came home from overseas, changed and broken. One afternoon, he found Marcus sitting alone in a booth at the restaurant, nursing coffee he wasn't drinking. "You're an idiot," Mr. Chen said bluntly, sitting across from him without invitation. "Probably," Marcus agreed quietly. "That woman loves you. Real love, not the kind that comes from pity or boredom." "I know," Marcus said, "but I can't let her what? Help you, love you, be part of your life." Mr. Chen shook his head. "Pride is a luxury for people who have nothing to lose. You have Daniel. You have a woman who would move mountains for you, and you're throwing it away because you're scared." "I'm not scared," Marcus said automatically. "Yes, you are. You're scared that if she's the one doing the saving, then you're not the strong one in the relationship. You're scared that needing her means losing her, and you're scared that maybe she's right, that maybe accepting help doesn't make you weak." Marcus felt something break inside him, the careful walls he'd built over years of independence cracking under the weight of truth. Meanwhile, Madison had been undergoing her own transformation. She'd spent the past 2 weeks examining herself honestly. She'd used her therapist and endless solitary hours to understand what she actually wanted versus what her fear demanded. She realized that loving Marcus had changed her fundamentally. For the first time, she wasn't trying to be his savior. She was trying to be his partner. That required trust, accepting that she couldn't control everything, supporting someone else's vision for their own life. So she did something radical. She called her CFO and set up a meeting with Marcus's potential business partner. She didn't offer money or connections. Instead, she did something far more valuable. She provided a comprehensive analysis of Marcus's architectural approach, highlighting the commercial viability of his sustainable design philosophy. She used her knowledge and expertise, not her wealth. When Marcus learned what she'd done, he understood she'd heard what he'd said and adapted, found a way to support him that respected his independence. He came to her penthouse on Friday evening with roses and an apology. "I'm sorry," he said when she opened the door, "for being stubborn and afraid." "I'm sorry too," Madison said, "for not respecting your need for autonomy." They held each other, and it felt like both an ending and a new beginning. By summer, Marcus's partnership had been formalized and official. The firm was preparing to break ground on their first major project, a mixed-income housing development in Queens. Madison had become an unofficial consultant, not because Marcus needed her money, but because her expertise was valuable. She and Daniel had developed a real relationship. They spent afternoons at museums, went to movies, and Daniel started referring to her as Madison rather than Miss Ashford. One warm June evening while Daniel was at camp, Marcus and Madison lay on his roof, looking at barely visible stars. "I've been thinking about something," Marcus said quietly. "What?" Madison asked, turning to look at him. "About the future. About whether you'd want to be part of mine, permanently." Madison's heart stopped. She knew what he was asking. "Yes," she said simply, "I want that. All of it, you, Daniel, the beautiful, complicated mess of building a life together. Even though I can't give you the fairy tale, even though my life comes with custody agreements and therapy sessions." "Especially because of that," Madison said, "because those things are real." When Marcus kissed her, it tasted like promise and commitment. Marcus proposed on a hot August afternoon in Central Park. They'd taken Daniel to the zoo, and as they were leaving, Daniel asked if Madison was going to be his mom. The question hung in the air. Madison felt her throat tighten. She looked at Marcus, saw vulnerability in his eyes. "That depends," Madison said. "Would you want me to be?" Daniel considered seriously. "Are you going to be around, like all the time?" "All the time," Madison promised. "If you want me to be." "Then yes," Daniel said decisively. "You should be my mom. DeMarcus produced a ring, an elegant vintage band with an emerald center stone, chosen because Madison had once mentioned emeralds reminded her of hope. "Madison Ashford," Marcus said, going down on one knee in the zoo parking lot, "will you marry me? Will you be Daniel's mother, my partner, my home?" Madison pulled him up and kissed him, not caring that people were staring, not caring that Daniel announced loudly that his dad was getting married. "Yes," she said through tears, "yes to all of it." The wedding was small and intimate in December at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with only their closest family and friends. Madison's father walked her down the aisle, his earlier skepticism replaced with genuine affection for Marcus. Daniel stood as ring-bearer, serious and proud. Marcus's best man was Mr. Chen. When Marcus saw Madison in her dress, a custom Vera Wang gown that was both elegant and unpretentious, his eyes filled with tears. This woman, who had accidentally walked in on him half-dressed, had become his person. "I promise to love you completely," Marcus said during his vows, "to be honest with you even when it's hard, to support your dreams while building our own together, and to never take for granted that you chose me." Madison's vows were simpler. "I promise to be present, to learn from you, to be brave enough to need you, and to love both of you with everything I have." After they were pronounced married, Daniel rushed between them. They both reached down to hold him, the three of them together as a family. A year later, Marcus and Madison stood in their housing development, watching families move into their new homes. The project had been featured in architectural magazines and received awards. More importantly, it had changed dozens of families' lives. Daniel, now 10, was thriving with two parents fully committed to his well-being. He'd started writing short stories, joined the school's robotics club. Madison had restructured her role at Ashford Industries, stepping back to focus on philanthropic initiatives. She and Marcus had created a foundation dedicated to supporting housing, education and mentorship programs for at-risk youth. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked one evening as they sat on the roof of their new house. "What?" Madison asked, though she understood. "Walking in on me in that hallway, getting entangled with a single father with a complicated past?" Madison considered the question. She thought about the life she would have had if she hadn't opened that door. Glamorous emptiness, accumulating things without accumulating meaning. "Never," she said finally. "Not for a single second." "You could have had anyone," Marcus said. "Someone without scars." "I didn't want anyone," Madison replied. "I wanted you, scars and all. Because those scars meant you'd lived, fought, survived. They meant you understood what it meant to lose and still keep going." Marcus pulled her close. They sat watching the sunset over the city that had brought them together. The scars on his body had faded over the years, pale lines barely visible. But they were still there, a map of everything he'd survived. "I never believed in fate," Madison said quietly. "But I'm starting to think that opening that door wasn't an accident." "No," Marcus agreed. "It wasn't." They sat in silence, watching the city transform from day to night. Two people who had learned that the most beautiful things in life, love, family, purpose, were often born from the most unexpected collisions, from moments when walls came down and people revealed their truest selves. Below them, the city hummed with millions of lives, but here on this roof, in this moment, there was only the two of them and the home they'd built together. Not from money or privilege, but from honesty, trust, and the willingness to see past scars to the person underneath. The scars that had once been Marcus's greatest shame had become his greatest gift, not because they made him interesting, but because they'd made him real. And it was his realness that Madison had loved, that had changed everything.